What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk about Metroid Samus Returns, the most recent entry into the Metroid series. One could even potentially call it the Metroid series' like revival, so to speak. It's a series that's been dead for quite a while at this point, something on the order of like 10 years. And I'm not someone who's been a Metroid fan for like my entire life kind of idea, but for the past like 5 or 6 years or so, it's been a series that's been pretty important to me personally. So I was pretty happy to hear that it was coming back, and in particular, the fact that there was a 2D game coming out as well as Metroid Prime 4 is what got me especially excited, because I'm really into the 2D games more so than the Prime games. So when it was announced that Samus was indeed returning, I was pretty happy. I was pretty hopeful for that the game would be good. So now the game has come out, I've played my way through it, and these are my thoughts. So right off the bat, one of the first things that I was kind of concerned about with this game when it was announced was the fact that you have omnidirectional aiming in this game. Which is to say that you can hold the L button to stand in place and aim wherever you want, in like a 360 degree kind of idea. And I was concerned that this would make the gameplay very kind of like stop and go. Like you'd have to stop to aim, and then aiming itself I imagine would be a little bit fiddly because that kind of thing always is. And I was concerned that it would really like reduce the mobility that you have in the other games. And there's also the melee counter that they added in this game, which is pretty cool. But I was kind of concerned about that it was almost like a consolation for having the free aim. It almost seemed to me like it was a way that they could have enemies still attacking Samus while she's standing still aiming at them, and have it not feel like you're being overwhelmed because like you have a recourse while you're standing still kind of idea. Those were my two main concerns about the game going in, and I would say that I was correct about both of them, but also that for the most part I think it ended up working out okay. I think that they were able to work in enough advantage for having the free aim for it to be worthwhile. I think it added more than it took away, but it definitely is still frustrating that you're constantly stopping whenever you come to a new enemy, which there's a lot of enemies in this game, and all of them are annoying, and all of them you pretty much have to stand still and start shooting them, and that's definitely a downside to this game. As for the melee counter, it is pretty cool, it's fun, I'm glad it's there. It's a nice addition to the game in a series where your kit looks pretty much exactly the same from game to game. But overall, like on a more high level, I would say that the controls of this game are still a problematic aspect of it. See, the thing is, using this thing here is a pain in the butt. To me, Metroid is not quite a precision platformer, but platforming is a really big part of it, and to me, it will never feel right on anything other than D-pad. So, when I first started up the game, my first inclination was I spent like 20 seconds pressing the D-pad wondering why Samus wasn't moving, because that's what I want to use. Of course, it makes a little bit of sense that you have to use the circle pad, because you have the free aiming mechanic, so obviously you can't input all the correct angles with the D-pad. You're very limited in that regard. And another issue with this is that one of the main things obviously that you do in Metroid is you use the morph ball, which in the 2D games is activated by pressing down twice typically. Obviously they have the ability to, you can just tap the touchscreen to morph as well in this game, which is handy, but the issue is that there isn't really a convenient way to do it in this game, because tapping down on the circle pad twice it's a little bit janky. It's like, I don't know. It feels like there isn't really a clean way to do it, especially when you're kind of in the heat of the moment kind of idea. So I found that it was often a little bit trickier than I would have liked to morph when I needed to, because like the difference between pressing a button twice and making downward motion twice is pretty big. It's when you're trying to input things quickly. And even just touching the tap screen, like, if your hands are like on the buttons, then going like that is a little bit problematic too, because that's like, this is kind of the same problem, right? You're stretching to go across the thing, but you have to move your hands so far to actually get to it. And these are kind of like minuscule problems, but it adds that little bit of like sloppiness to the feel of the game, and that's not a good thing. I think a good happy medium was if there was some kind of analog stick that you could use, because at that point it's like, at least you have a little bit better ergonomics than the circle pad, because with the circle pad you're like pressing your thumb into the pad, and it kind of screws up the ergonomics a little bit. And at least with that, it's like you're basically just like tilting your hand, your thumb like side to side, rather than like putting your thumb in the circle and sliding it around. If only there was some kind of Nintendo console that had an analog stick. And kind of on a similar idea, I feel like the actual controls of this game feel a little bit bloated as well. And kind of further along the theme of like ergonomics, I would say that the controls in this game, just on the whole, are actually a little bit bloated. You have the whole D-pad to select your Aether abilities thing, which is okay, but it makes it a little bit clumsy because there isn't really a quick way to activate a singular ability. If you come into a situation where you find that you suddenly need one of your Aether abilities, you have to not only press the D-pad, but take your thumb off of the circle pad to press the D-pad, and then you have to hit A to activate. What would be really nice is if you could at least double tap on the D-pad to turn an ability on or off. But I think one of the bigger problems is the fact, because you now have the hold L to aim thing, and you also have hold R to shoot missiles instead of your beam buster thingy. You have two shoulder buttons that you have to hold in different contexts, and I found that at least for the first half of the game or so, I often kind of got confused in the heat of the moment which button was which. So I would, a lot of times if I wanted to fire missiles, I would just hold both buttons, even if that's not strictly necessary. And kind of even further along that point, when you're holding both shoulder buttons down at the same time, it almost kind of like, if you're like holding the thing, it almost kind of locks up your hands a little bit, so that the feeling of like moving your thumbs around your hands are kind of like jarred in this position all of a sudden, and it's kind of like I was saying about ergonomics. It kind of hurts it in that front. But anyways, I've kind of railed on about the controls enough for now. So another kind of point of contention about this game for me is just the way that the game is balanced, because it's very strange to me. So when it comes to difficulty and stuff like that, Metroid has pretty much always been this game where it's about survival. It's about managing your resources. You know, you kill enemies to get drops from them, and you're just constantly trying to keep your health high and all that kind of stuff. And I would say that that's true of Samus Returns as well, but the first half of this game and the second half feel completely different. And in this context, I would say that it's because the difficulty in the first half is way higher for some reason. Basically, it comes down to the economy of upgrades. One of the things that's always kind of interesting to me about Metroid games is that usually there's kind of like an internal difficulty slider, which is how much exploring are you doing? If you do a lot of exploring, then you're going to find a lot of upgrades, and that is going to make things easier for you. But in this one, there's a low enough number of E-tanks in the game that that's not really the case. At least not until like the very end of the game. There's never really a point where you can go scrounging around and just randomly find an E-tank. Almost all of them are on kind of what you would probably consider the main path. There's only maybe 2 of them that I can recall that were not in that category, and they're both locked behind fairly endgame upgrades. So for the first half of the game, you're basically in this situation where your health is very low, and the E-tanks that you're getting are roughly, 1 per area. And so what's happening is that as the enemies are getting stronger, you're gaining more E-tanks. And it's not about, you're not really getting any stronger in that instance. You're basically just kind of maintaining the status quo. And the status quo in this case is that you're pretty much always dying in about 4 hits. At least 4, good hits from enemies that are not like bats or whatever. And so while Metroid, like I said, has always been about surviving and trying to keep your health high and all that kind of stuff, in Samus Returns, for a lot of the game, it feels like you're overly punished for your mistakes. It's like, if you miss your melee counter on a random shell bug thing, then you're taking like half an E-tank worth of damage, which is going to take like 5 enemies to claw back. You can very easily make mistakes that are going to cost you a lot in this game. And this gets better in the second half, but the up until the first like 4 or so areas are really rough. Once you get past that and you start getting more upgrades, things smooth out a lot, and I would say that it's at a very good level. Some of the final bosses in this game are actually really fun, and they're hard, but they're not unfair. And that's definitely not all of the bosses in this game. Some of the Metroid variants, I can think of one in particular that I would consider actually like really cheap. Like, it doesn't telegraph its attacks very well. It's just really annoying in basically every conceivable way. And I mentioned a little bit there how like the second half of this game, the difficulty improves a lot, and I would say that that's actually true of like pretty much everything in this game. The pacing in general is just so odd because, like I said, at the start of the game, you're kind of drip-fed ingredients, especially as you approach like kind of the middle area. What would you call it, the middle? I guess maybe kind of like the second fifth or so. For whatever reason, the upgrade income kind of slows down a lot. And it gets really, like, it's really hard and really frustrating, but it's also just doesn't really get that in. Like, the amount of interest in the game kind of plummets at that point in my experience. But then you kind of reach a point where all of a sudden you arrive in like the second half of the game. It's not like a clear-cut point, but like you start getting a whole bunch of upgrades in a row, you start getting new tools pretty rapidly, and all of a sudden things get really cool again. And it's like, this game without a full toolkit is a lot worse than it is with a full toolkit. Which it kind of speaks to, I think, some of the failings of this game. Because to me, one of the strengths of Metroid, again, has always been the evolution of gameplay throughout the game. When you start off, you don't have a lot of tools, so you kind of have to make do with what you have. But oftentimes, there's kind of like things you can do. And when you get new tools, it's just kind of making it easier for you. And I guess you can kind of say that that's true of this game, but there's a lot of kind of like binary, like, you need this to do this, and if you don't have this, then fuck you. And that's almost kind of like a feeling that permeates the game in general. It's very kind of like, here's A, here's B, and like, this is the path that you walk. And Metroid 2, like, I guess I should mention, is that because I'm kind of getting into more the level design aspect of this game now, Metroid 2 has a kind of rigid structure to it. And Samus Returns is a remake of Metroid 2, if you weren't aware. So the concept of Metroid 2 is that you arrive on SR-388, and you have to kill all the Metroids on the planet. And the way this works out is that each area of the game is kind of like gated by a certain number of Metroids. So once you clear out all the Metroids in a specific area, then the lava empties and you can move on to the next area. So it's very like area to area to area to area. It's very kind of got that linear kind of flow to it. So the level design of this game is kind of constrained in that way a little bit. Because typically the way Metroids work is that you have kind of like a big labyrinth and you have to kind of find your way around it. Whereas in this game, it's kind of forced to be, like I said, area to area to area kind of idea. But I feel like Metroid Samus Returns kind of takes it a little bit too far. Like, some of the areas are very complicated, but it's complexity instead of depth. They're not very elegantly designed, such that if you ever have to backtrack through those areas, it gets really frustrating and annoying to find your way around sometimes. And getting new upgrades doesn't really help that much for navigating these areas, which again is another thing that traditionally Metroid does very well. You'll have areas where it's like, oh, well, I have the high jump now, so I can take all these shortcuts in this old area that I have to revisit. And instead, what Samus Returns does, it is almost like a cop-out. It's like they put in these teleporters, which is not in itself a bad thing to have teleporters, but it's almost like they needed them to make it so that backtracking through this game was actually bearable. And like, further to that point, this game is actually really big. There's just a lot of raw space in this game, and it almost feels like they decided to go for a lot of areas instead of really well-built areas. I was talking about kind of the first half or second fifth of the game or so a moment ago, and another problem that space has is that this game is that those areas I feel are especially poorly designed. There's never really like an indication of what the intended path is through those areas, and you're kind of left to just kind of wander and hope you find the right things and hope that you don't accidentally walk into a room that drops you into a lava pit when you have no health. Because that can happen. That's a room that exists. That part of the game is just particularly sadistic for whatever reason. But anyways, I've railed on the failings of this game more than enough at this point. So I would say that some of the strengths of it is that, for one, I complained about the controls a lot at the start of this game, but in general, when Samus is doing what you want her to do, the controls actually do feel fairly good. You know, running around, jumping, and all this kind of stuff, it works pretty good. I wish the screw attack was a little bit stronger, which is just one of those things where it's like, you get the screw attack, you want to just kind of jump through enemies. You can kind of do that for the most part, but it's kind of weak in this game. There's a lot of enemies that you just kind of bounce off of, and you have to like screw attack into them again. I don't know, it's weird. They did a fairly good job of making the spider ball bearable. I personally have always hated the spider ball as an upgrade. Of course, it's a staple in Metroid 2. But at least in this game, you don't have the same issue of you have to crawl around the ceilings of every room, and then you're going to drop a bomb, and you're going to accidentally blow yourself off the ceiling, or the spider ball is just really slow, and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't really have many of those problems. I think AM2R did a little bit of that, but they have some decent puzzles with this game where they can't really be solved through other means, and it kind of uses the spider ball intelligently, and I appreciate that. I think that a lot of people are not really a fan of the scan pulse upgrade. I think it works out fairly well. I think it's probably a little bit overkill, in my opinion. Like, I think maybe it could have done without revealing the entire map around you. Not the entire map, but like several squares around you. I think just it highlighting areas in the current screen, or the kind of the current vicinity, I guess, where there are like destructible blocks and stuff like that. I think that probably would have been sufficient, but I think having that tool in place and available to you early on is a really good way of keeping people engaged in the game, and not while also still having kind of the typical level of Metroid, you know, where's the hidden block, like where all the secrets kind of feel. I know that personally, I'm always a much bigger fan of games that kind of point you in the right direction of where all the secrets are, so it's actually possible to find them all without kind of like shooting every block on the screen kind of thing. So like I said, I think the scan pulse probably goes a little too far, but I would rather too far than not far enough, in my personal opinion. Also, as much as I complained about the omnidirectional aiming and stuff like that, and the controls at the start of this video, I would say that the combat in this game worked out pretty well. Which is not entirely surprising, considering this is a game by Mercury Steam. One assumes that this is based off of the Mirror of Fate engine, which was a 3DS Castlevania game in the Lords of Shadows series, which was a pretty reasonable game in my opinion. It was very combat focused, and you can kind of feel that the combat in this game is not necessarily inspired by that, but it kind of has, it's just high quality, I guess I would say, for the most part. I think the melee counter works out really well. It's a really great way to open up enemies and gain advantages over bosses if you can figure out how to use the melee counter. If you can't figure it out, there's nothing in the game that requires you to kill it with that, except maybe there's probably one enemy, but that's whatever. But just in general, when you're fighting really hard enemies in this game, like some of the end game bosses, it's when they're going well and you got their patterns and you're just kind of going through the motions and you're killing it. It just feels really good. It's really satisfying. And that's kind of this game on a whole, really. Like, I guess, like, when it's at its peak and it's kind of doing its thing, then this is a pretty entertaining experience. When it's kind of floundering a little bit and it's like you're kind of like, what are you doing, game? Like, why is your pacing this bad? Why is this area so poorly designed? Why are these enemies so sadistic? It's a pretty grueling experience. Like, there was a point around the middle where I was constantly thinking, this game is so frustrating. Everything in this game is just so frustrating. Like, but eventually, I pushed past that, I got to the good stuff, and in the end, I would say this is a pretty solid experience. I don't think I would give it the 85-90% kind of scores that a lot of media outlets are giving it, personally, which is a little weird considering I'm such a big Metroid fan. But I would say that I'm really glad that this game came out. I'm glad that it's being well received, and hopefully this is a good sign for the franchise that is yet to come, especially the fact that this is a 2D game, which is what I personally want to especially see more of. So, with any hopes, this can launch the 2D Metroids back into the heart of gaming. But anyways, I've rambled enough for one video, so those are my thoughts on Samus Returns. See you later.